How are things going in terms of your stress level? It may have to do with if things are not okay. It may have to do with how your boundaries are. We're going to look at those next on this edition of Journey to Healing.
Welcome to Journey to Healing. Do you find yourself discouraged, troubled, in need of healing, but not sure where to turn? John Euler, a licensed professional counselor, is here to help. John has more than 25 years of professional experience helping people deal with the issues that keep them emotionally and spiritually stuck. There is help. There is hope. There is a God who loves you and wants to help you find peace and strength. And John Euler is here to help you find that on this edition of Journey to Healing.
Okay. Welcome back, everyone. My name is John Euler. This is Journey to Healing. We are in a series within a series. The overall series is Grief and Loss. We are doing a deep dive and have been doing so now for a number of weeks into the issue of boundaries. The reason being is if you do not have your boundaries as they should be, then things will continue to be stirred up in the present day so that things will never calm down long enough in order to go back and process and heal and bring closure to the past. When people seek out counseling, oftentimes they're not aware of what some of the key issues are. They know what the symptoms are. They know what they experience. Oftentimes, they don't even know they are symptoms. They usually will come in for depression, for anxiety. A number of people have panic attacks. Some people have compulsive disorders. Those are behaviors that they do repetitively, such as emotional eating. That would be one. They're coming in for relationship issues, but most people are not aware of the fact that the two primary things that cause problems are issues from the past that are not finished, and so we are, in a way, acting out of the past. Not that the past predicts the future, but if I haven't adequately resolved things in the past, I will be carrying them forward. And that's why, and this is one test for you, have you ever found yourself getting frustrated and suddenly you're acting like a teenager? You know that no adult is supposed to throw things or hit. Matter of fact, what age does that sound like, right? Do not hit, do not throw. We're talking small children. But how is it that fully grown adults that know better, that would never do that at work? Sometimes they do, but that life expectancy of that job is not very long. But they'll do that at home. Why? Something happens. And we've looked at that. We've been looking at a lot of things pertaining to selfishness and those of us that may have been injured and how we react out of that injury. Part of that is an inability to establish boundaries. So we've been looking at boundaries. I would recommend going back, listening to previous podcasts that will actually bring you up to this point, as we're going to begin to look at if you know you should implement boundaries, if you know you are convinced, then what's preventing you? Because if you're pretty persuaded and you're not doing it, there's a reason why, but one thing's for sure, nothing's going to change. So what you've always gotten from the past, if you don't do anything, you'll continue to get that, especially if it has to do with somebody in your life who is not curbing their own behavior. That's why it's important to be able to implement boundaries. So if you would like to access previous podcasts, the easiest way to do that is through our site, SurvivorSupport.net. Up at the top, you'll see podcasts. There's the podcast tab. Click on that, and it will bring you up to date. We are a little behind getting some programs on there, but there's a lot on there, trust me. So hopefully we'll catch up We do have last week's program. We looked at Anne. I interviewed interviewed Anne, and she told her personal story for the first time in public, dealing with a near-death experience at the hands of her husband, who was a domestically violent abuser. He nearly killed her. It required her jumping out of a vehicle at about 45 miles an hour to save her life. And as she reflected during that interview, and as we've talked about in the past, there were red flags that were missed. Now, Anne is extremely competent, extremely capable, extremely intelligent. So the question is, how did she find herself in that position? Over time and little by little. Extremely adept manipulators are very calculating in their methodology, I should say, how they methodically approach things. Now, is every single selfish individual 100% calculating? Not necessarily at first. They may or may not scan a crowd and find somebody, though more adept perpetrators do. But over time, somebody can become selfish, and selfish to a point that they become hurtful. They become an oppressor. Unless stopped, that will continue to grow. The more sophisticated or bright or intelligent someone is, the less overt, at least out in public, that will happen. So we've set the stage for looking at what are boundaries and why are they necessary. Boundaries are limits. Limits on what? Somebody's behavior, somebody's attitude, somebody's actions, somebody's words. If somebody will not dial it back themselves, and the reason they would not be doing that is they are no longer listening to their conscience, because conscience is designed to get my attention to show me how I am negatively impacting somebody else. So if I've gotten to a point where I can, with impunity, be able to negatively impact somebody, you can rest assured I'm no longer listening to my conscience. Now, how far will I take that? If somebody gets on a roll with their selfishness, they will take it as far as they can. They will do it in such a way that it will be all about them and nothing about you, meaning they will encroach upon your boundaries. Another way of putting that is they will hop your fence. They'll hop your boundaries. They will transgress. And they don't intend to stop. If they intended to stop, they would have already done that. They would have apologized. They would have been humble. They would have fulfilled 1 John 1:9, which is, if we confess our sins, sin is a purposeful missing of the mark. That's an archery term. I know what I'm supposed to do. I know the requirements. I'm choosing not to. This is not an accident. A transgression presupposes there's a boundary. You can't trespass on public property unless the officers tell you you can't go on there. But let's say a public park. That's for anybody. So there's really no boundaries other than don't mess up the grass or something, right? But anybody can be there. So the difference between private property and public property is ownership and boundaries. So if you were to call the police and say, I want to report a trespasser, we're here in Central Park and there's this guy that has put his blanket next to me, let's say far enough, and they'll say, what are you talking about? Well, he's on my piece of grass. And they'll say, what address? And you say, Central Park. They'll say, what are you talking about? It's public property. That's different than if they are on your yard. Now you have the right, but you have to know you have the right. That's an analogy to our lives. Selfish people will continue to encroach. So boundaries are limits that need to be implemented and placed upon another person's negative, detrimental, hurtful, harmful, or emotionally irresponsible behavior, speech, or attitude that negatively or detrimentally impacts you or someone else after it has become clear that his or her behavior is not inadvertent, merely human error, merely the result of mistakes. We all make mistakes. That's why you have to discern this. As a matter of fact, let me go back and read that again, because I'm setting the stage for how and why you need to have boundaries. The first thing is you have to become clear. Have to become clear on what? Okay. You have to become clear on the fact that somebody is doing something that's negatively impacting you or someone else. Okay. So boundaries are simply limits implemented and placed upon another person's negative, detrimental, hurtful, harmful, or emotionally irresponsible speech or attitude or behavior. I covered everything. That negatively or detrimentally impacts you or others. I have to stop that. And when do I implement boundaries on negative or detrimental behavior? After it's become clear that the person's behavior is not inadvertent, it's kind of accidental, not merely human error. We all make mistakes. Not merely the result of a lack of understanding, not the result of a lack of awareness, meaning they're unaware of what they're doing, and not the result of their own emotional pain that they didn't realize was negatively impacting others. Okay? How can you make sure of that? So I have to be sure before I implement boundaries that I can do that. I have the right, but more than that, I have it's necessity that I better do that. Well, I'd better be able to discern and adequately be able to satisfy within myself that there is no doubt, again, that this behavior that is impacting me or someone else is not the result of just accidental stuff, human error, merely the result of a mistake or a lack of understanding, lack of awareness, or that the other person is in emotional pain, but they're still impacting other people. And that's an important one. Everybody is entitled to be in pain because a lot of people are. But people are not entitled to negatively impact somebody. That's a challenge. That's where grace comes in. We all understand somebody working through something that's very difficult. Most people don't even need to be told to cut somebody some slack if they're really going through something difficult. If they've gotten significant news that's changed the course of their life, we're going to naturally, I haven't met too many people that aren't willing to cut that person some slack. But what happens, and that's the worst case scenario, right? Somebody's going through something and now they are oozing. That's where the term hurt people. So people that have been wounded, people that have been hurt people. That's when I'm okay with that phrase. But I'm not okay with simply leaving that phrase. Okay, so we have to acknowledge what's going on. We bring grace because there's always the application of the two key principles when it comes to human relationships, truth and grace. Grace for those areas of someone's life that they are not intending to be hurtful, but they have been hurt. But truth where it becomes clear and increasingly clear that the person doesn't care enough is violating their conscience. Okay? The more someone violates conscience, the more truth needs to be brought to bear, not grace. If you bring grace to where truth needs to be brought to bear, now you are enabling. You are cutting the person's slack. It's not going to be helpful, but is giving them license to continue to morph into a greater degree of, and we've talked about this in the past, I recommend go back and look at some of the podcasts, a greater degree of piggishness. We have referenced Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 7, verse 6. He says, do not cast your pearls, do not give your pearls, the things that are important to you, your time, effort, energy, resources, things about you and from you, do not give them to a selfish pig. Do not cast your pearls before swine. Why? Because they will not appreciate anything you're doing, your time, effort, energy, and resources. They will trample those pearls, so now you are actually a poor steward, and that would be bad enough. But now they're going to add insult to injury. So they're going to trample your pearls, and now they're going to turn on you. Now they start to become actively hurtful in some fashion. starting with disrespect. And then if you try to turn the spigot off on the pearls, you'll really find out what they're made of. So Jesus himself said, do not give what is important to pigs, and don't give what is holy. He said it in the prior verse. He said, don't give what is holy or special in the sense that it should be reserved for those most important. Do not give what is holy or that which is special to dogs. Okay, so he was referencing dogs being outside the home, pigs being inside the home. We shouldn't be interacting with them. There's only one thing that's going to happen, and it's predictable every time. But when we get confused about who we should or shouldn't be dealing with and how long, that's when the issues happen. So I need to be able to understand and discern who a reasonable person is who's in pain versus a pig or a dog. Another word that's equivalent also comes from 3,000 years ago, the term fool. And that is not a minor thing. When somebody morphs into that degree of selfishness, it's all about them. And they've likely passed the point of no return. We've talked about that in a previous podcast. So once I determine that someone is not going to stop, that intends to continue, and the smarter they are, the more subtle it will be, then I have to begin to take action myself because they're not going to. Why? Because they like it this way. That's why they haven't changed it. Oh, they know. How do we know? In two ways. We find out, are they smart? Are they with it? Do they get it? We've covered that in previous podcasts. The other is, I have communicated with them in a graduated fashion as far as speaking truth. By the time boundaries are implemented, there should have been an increasing degree of truth and truthfulness discussed, unless it has to do with potential violence. Then do not say anything, but you need to get away. Okay, if someone is really, the other person, if the pig is really conniving and potentially hurtful, then do not disclose anything with them, in the sense that they may actually, they'll plan to sabotage you and do something to hurt you. But if it has to do with just shy of actual physical violence, if in doubt, you need to find out. That's pretty good in this sense. You should have already, by the time you implement boundaries, you should have already begun or have begun to have those discussions about the different issues. So I need to speak the truth in love. That's that first level, which is I need to, in a reasonable fashion, if you want to find out what love is, and we talked about that in the podcast, How Big of a Pig, and the 3 things that will keep us from seeing the pigs in our life, part 1. Okay, I need to be able to, in a reasonable fashion, begin to speak to whatever the issue is. If I haven't been addressing anything, and I suddenly now implement boundaries, the question is, what's up with that? That's really not a boundary. And plus, when they start to press in, which they will in whatever way, you're either going to become reactive or you're going to cave. So boundaries are not punitive. Boundaries reflect reality, and they confirm someone else's choices. You can't control anybody else. So if, and this is sort of the worst case scenario, if a selfish person can actually tell you, I don't get, where'd this come from? Like, what are you doing? Now, they'll say that anyways, but if they really have a point that if you've never said anything, and then you suddenly do the nuclear option, then you have an issue. Now, again, it takes wisdom, and that's why find decent people that you can trust, that you can kind of bounce this off of as far as what are the incremental steps you should be taking, but you always should be taking incremental steps, little by little. If it's gotten to a point where it's detrimental for you and others to have that person in your life or to be around them, you cannot afford to do status quo because it'll continue to be hurtful, and the selfish person will continue to grow in their selfishness. And you'll you'll do nobody any good. Okay, so here's some key points. Let me see if I covered this. So you have to become clear in order to implement boundaries. You have to become clear on the inside where their behavior is coming from. So you have to make sure, okay, they know. It's not accidental. How do you know that they know? Because you've talked to them about it. You've raised the issues. You've spoken the truth in love. And then you've actually implemented the next level, which is as iron sharpens iron, because now you've discovered this is not a lack of information. This is not inadvertent. This is actually habitual, but now it's moving to characterological. This is part of their character. That's a little bit different, isn't it? I mean, if you find out that the person really is selfish, okay, now you're going to have some different kinds of conversations. And now it's like chipping rust a little bit, as iron sharpens iron, or a nail file, an actual big one. Okay. If that doesn't do it, then the third level of conversation is we need to have a spur. A spur is not a happy thing, right? A spur is a motivational tool if you ride horses that at the very last of these steps to try to motivate a horse. First is, from what I hear, I'm not the most equestrian kind of guy, but at first you give little sounds, little clicks, come on, right? That should motivate the horse. If that doesn't, the rider typically will kind of get their attention with the end of the bridle, kind of give them a little whip. And if that doesn't, what do? The horses, the mule's digging in their heels, so the rider will apply a little bit of motivation. Okay, that's spurring one another on to love. So that has to do a lot of that has to do with attitude and the effect it's having on other people. So I'm going to not cut them slack in any area. This doesn't mean I'm rigid. What it means is this: we all need to raise the bar to ensure that a home or an organization is reasonable and decent to be around, so that people don't have to walk on eggshells, and so that reality is reflected, so that we are always upping the bar in terms of helping people be their best. Nobody benefits when the lowest common denominator becomes what's acceptable. So spur one another on to love and good works, right? We want to believe the best in someone. If I believe that someone's gotten to a point that they can't change, then I'm not believing the best in them, am I? I'm thinking them an old dog, because you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And I'm not going to believe that a person is on the same level as a dog. Okay, so what are some key points to remember about selfishness? Because I have to become convinced in order to implement boundaries. I have to become convinced that what the person is doing is selfishness, that they know. Okay, so what are some key points to remember? That just because someone has gotten away with being selfish for years does not mean they get to be selfish any longer. Well, after all, this is how your father's... No, what it means is just because your father's gotten away with it for this long, well, after all, that's just the way they... Why is that just the way they are? I'll tell you exactly why that's just the way they are. Because nobody has said, that's enough of being just the way you are. So they've allowed this person, male or female, remember we talked about Mother Gothel, I'll tell you why a selfish person continues to be a selfish person. Because people permit it. Now, can a selfish person be selfish by themselves alone? I don't know. Does a tree make a sound falling in a forest? I guess they could be selfish, but guess what? They're fully entitled to be selfish. We're not really telling them not to be selfish. What we're telling them is this: if you're going to be selfish, you're not going to be selfish around here. We're removing the audience, or we're helping you on to other pastures, and have at it. You can be king of your own castle and do whatever you want, but not over here. So the only reason somebody is able to be selfish for years is somebody has enabled that. And they've gone against what Jesus has said. They've gone against what Peter said, who used the same words. They've gone against what Paul said. They've gone against what Solomon has said. Right? You remember what Solomon said? He said this is 3,000 years ago, Proverbs 22, verse 10. 3,000 years ago says this: throw out or drive out The mocker or the scoffer in fighting, contention, strife will go out too. Quarrels and insults and strife and abuse will cease and disappear. Let me read that again. Now it's written in Hebrew, so I pulled out from different people that know Hebrew, good commentaries. Okay, so this is what the actual language says. Throw out or drive out the mocker. What's a mocker? Most of us know. It's somebody, right? It's someone, is that how you're like? Oh, well. So they'll repeat, they mock, they use disdain, they're disrespectful. A scoffer is, So somebody that's walking around, giving you all sorts of lip, sitting there telling you basically, who are you? And they mimic you, and they little facial hand gestures, facial expressions, they make fun of you. That's a mocker, that's a scoffer. If somebody is morphed into that kind of person, they are a pig. Now the question is, how long are you going to tolerate that? Because that person is never going to change because they don't want to, because they've morphed into one. They've morphed into a category, and it doesn't bother them. That's why they're not going to stop. You have to stop them. How do you do it? You can't control them. You have to implement a boundary. So you're going to drive out or throw out. Now, how do you do that? Carefully. With seeking a lot of counsel, but certainly we can tell from that verse, we have to distance ourselves. It may be that you're the one that has to leave. That may actually be the case. But you need to get out or get them out. After you're sure, it's time for them to go. What, divorce? I didn't say that. Separation. Okay? And if you do, then fighting, contention, and strife goes out. Why? Because it's attached to them. They go, and suddenly all the fighting and all the contention and all the strife in your home goes. All the quarrels, insults, and abuse will cease and disappear. That's 3,000 years ago. That was written. I haven't heard many good sermons on that. Okay? That is what we should be doing. And so if you find yourself living with that kind of person, it's time to implement boundaries. So just because someone has gotten away with being selfish for years does not mean they get to be selfish for the rest of their life. They will. Unless somebody says, you know what, nothing personal, but we're done with that. Okay? There is no tenured track for selfishness. Well, he's been that way for so long, you know what? That's just the way he is. And that's the way he is because people tolerate it. So there's no tenured track for selfishness where a certain amount of years you're that way and you get a lifelong pass, where others are required to cut you some slack with your continued selfishness. No, that doesn't get to happen. If you allow that, it's predictable because you're casting pearls before swine. So just because that's just the way they've been doesn't mean it's okay. There's never an excuse to continue to be selfish or immature. If you are negatively impacting another person, that does not come out of hurt. That comes out of selfishness. Hurt people do not hurt people once they know the information, and it doesn't take much to read the facial expression of someone that you've hurt. Okay, so let me be clear. Hurt people do not hurt people. Okay? Here is the phrase. Selfish people hurt people. If you've been hurt, it's fine. Right? You aren't responsible for what you're given, but you are responsible for what you do with it. Just because you have been on the receiving end of somebody's abuse and hurtfulness, and that's legitimate, and probably if you've become hurtful, you're not dealing with it properly. As a matter of fact, I can guarantee you, you're not dealing with it properly. So it's time. But if you have given yourself an excuse because you were hurt, now you're going to dish it out. Now, I'll give you a hint. Your hurt for this time doesn't matter anymore. Why? Because you're being hurtful. You're dishing it out. You were oppressed and now you've become an oppressor. It's time to stop. Now, your pain is legitimate once you stop. If you don't stop, your pain is not legitimate. So you're only eligible for truth. Grace is there in abundance, and it will come rushing to you, God's help will, if you humble yourself. But if you stay hurtful because you've been hurt, then you get to be hurtful alone. And therefore, you can't be hurtful anymore. But you can stay a curmudgeon. You can stay miserable. But not around other people. Why? Because people matter. And by the way, if you know what it feels like to be hurt, why in the world would you ever want to do that to someone else? We will continue as we look at what are some of the prerequisites of implementing boundaries, what is key in order to be able to implement an effective boundary. We will look at that on the other side of the break.
Are you or someone you know a survivor of abuse and wondering where to turn for trustworthy help and insight into the effects of such abuse? Ever wish you had access to a resource that could help you continue your progress in healing? SurvivorSupport.net is that resource. Developed by John Mueller, a seasoned therapist with years of experience working with sexual abuse survivors, SurvivorSupport.net is a one-of-a-kind resource to help you understand the impact of abuse and to help you understand the nature of those who harmed you in order to help you gain clarity and continue healing. If you are interested in speaking with John Mueller about your situation or in having John conduct a consultation or a training for your church or organization, SurvivorSupport.net serves as a convenient method of contacting him. Our program, Journey to Healing, is made possible through the generous donations of viewers like you. There are many opportunities and needs that Survivor Support is attempting to meet, and your monthly support or one-time gift would be extremely helpful as we seek to meet those needs and opportunities. Simply visit SurvivorSupport.net and you will see the link to donate on the homepage. We thank you.